Well, after months of polls and advertisements and debates and all the things that go along with the political process, we're just days away from what is probably going to be one of the most consequential elections in United States history. In this episode of the Weekly Scroll, I'm going to share some things with you. I'm going to tell you where I stand on some things. Let's get into it.
If you enjoy watching this and other great content from Jacob's Tent, download the Jacob's Tent app today. Gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
Welcome to the Weekly Scroll. We are back from Sukkot, and we're ready to get back to sharing some thoughts about things that are going on in the world and in our nation. Of course, the big news right now is the upcoming election on Tuesday. As we film this, we're just a matter of days away from what is shaping up to be one of the more consequential elections in modern U.S. history. And in fact, in my view, it's not been since the 1860s that an election has been so pregnant with ramifications, depending on which way it goes. So on one side of the political spectrum, the significant issues are the economy, inflation, the ever-rising costs of living, immigration, open borders, the infiltration of the country by violent gangs and criminals, and just the overall lack of security. And add to that, there's the escalation of hostilities in the world, Russia, Ukraine, in the Middle East. There's a Chinese threat that's looming, and all these things are going on, and all of them are very, very important issues and are going to drive many people to the polls at this election cycle. Now, on the other hand, we've got people in this nation who believe that secondary to some of those things that I just mentioned, we've got so-called reproductive rights that are very important to them, and what they perceive to be a threat to a woman's right to choose. They see that as the primary issue that is driving them to go out and to vote this election cycle. Of course, abortion has been for some time and continues to be a very big issue for the Democratic Party and their candidate. In fact, this is Bill's view. It seems to me that abortion is the only issue that Vice President Harris and those who support her can really speak on with any amount of clarity and passion. And I would say that they are very clear on the matter. They want abortion. They're very passionate about it. It is sacred to them, it seems. It's taken on almost godlike status among those who support it, particularly in the Democratic Party and the extreme left of that party. And with that in mind, I want you to consider this. We know from the Bible that in ancient times, men and women of Israel, when they had fallen into spiritual decline, they would offer their infant children to the false god Molech. And I bring that out for this very interesting point. That word Molech is phonetically equivalent to the Hebrew word melech. And melech is the Hebrew word for king, K-I-N-G. My point is this. Abortion and all that is associated with it has a particular power over those who support it, just as a monarch, or perhaps better put in this particular case, a principality. Just as some ruler has power over its subjects, abortion has power over these people. They venerate it. They worship it. They're viciously loyal to their god called abortion. Now, it is this perverse loyalty to what amounts to murder and the complete lack of regard for the sanctity of life that has led to other perverse positions, so-called trans rights, same-sex marriage, and a host of other advocacies that stand in direct opposition to the Word of God and to biblical principle. Now, to be fair, I realize that not all Democrats, not all independents, feel as strongly about abortion as others do. And there are some Democrats and independents who are very concerned about border security, inflation, and the spread of war. I realize that not all Republicans stand firmly against abortion or same-sex marriage. Actually, in my opinion, Trump's position on abortion is somewhat ambiguous. In other words, I'm not really certain exactly how he stands on abortion, other than he feels that it is best left to the states to decide about these things, and that's why a position was removed from the Republican platform. And in other words, and this is the point, there's probably a fair amount of overlap when it comes to these issues and who supports what and who supports that. And so that being said, for me, the issue is very clear. The Democratic Party as a whole is openly, proudly advocating for things that are perverse, things that are wicked, and things that promote death. And so for me, this election isn't about policies per se. It's not about prosperity. It's not about personalities. It's not really about parties. This election is about life and death. It's about things that are good as opposed to things that are evil. It's about whether or not there will be light in this nation or whether we will be plunged into utter darkness. Now, I know that there are some of you who feel that we are already there, that is, plunged into darkness. And to a degree, I agree with you. However, I don't believe that we have seen the depths of darkness to which some are willing to go. And we are seeing that being voiced in this election cycle. If we think things are dark now, I shudder to imagine what will happen if, as a nation, we elect those who boast of making infanticide a federally supported and a federally protected right. A right. So all of this brings me to this question. Should believers vote? Considering the corruption that we know to be a part of the political process, should we participate in the electoral process? Now, as we get into this, I realize that I am likely to encourage some of you, make some of you very happy, and I'm also aware of the fact that I'm probably going to say some things that are going to anger some of you, and I realize it will probably provoke lots of commentary. Nevertheless, here we go. When asked by religious people if it were lawful to pay taxes to the Roman government, Yeshua replied, "Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar." And what exactly did he mean by that? Well, in my view, he is saying to us that even though we are not of this world, we're still in this world. And consequently, from time to time, we will be compelled to engage in activities and processes that aren't necessarily concerned with kingdom principles or, for that matter, God's agenda. Yet, at the same time, we see that God is the one who raises up kings. He's the one who raises up kingdoms. He's the one who brings down those kings and kingdoms, and all for his purpose. Furthermore, throughout history, we see that God has used his people to influence those kings and kingdoms so that his purpose for that king or for that kingdom might be fulfilled. Daniel comes to mind. Here is a man, for all we know, was a very righteous man, yet he went into exile. We find him in Babylon. And while he is in Babylon, he served the kings of Babylon. He served the kings of Persia. Some of his contemporaries, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they were officials in Nebuchadnezzar's government. That is, they were officials in the Babylonian government. I want to highlight this. Babylon to believers is the epitome of everything that God detests and abhors. And yet these righteous men served as administrators in that government. God calls us to be a set-apart people, but he doesn't call us to be isolated in terms of what goes on in this world. We are to influence this world. Now, in an affiliated vein of thought, at least in my mind, Paul encouraged believers to obey the rulers and the authorities that God has set over us. And that included paying taxes. And he says this, first of all, because it's the right thing for us as believers to do. But he says it also because he has hopes that we might be able to lead peaceful and quiet lives. And so being subject to rulers and leaders and governments is, in Paul's thinking, how we more readily live a peaceful life, which is obviously desirable for us all. So my point then is that Paul addressed the fact that in an apples and oranges way, in comparison to what Yeshua said, we are called upon to render unto Caesar that which pertains to Caesar. I also want you to keep this in mind. Paul lived in a world, Yeshua lived in a world for that matter, but they lived in a world that was subject to tyrants, to monarchies, all these kinds of things. And so if Paul said that under those particular conditions, how much more desirable would it have been for Paul and for others? I'm talking about believers now. How much more desirable would it have been for them to not be under the rule of tyrants and despots? In other words, if Paul longed to live a peaceful and quiet life, would he not have opted to enjoy more freedoms had he been given that opportunity? Because if he had been given that opportunity, it would seem logical anyway, to presume that he would have been allowed to evangelize even more and less fettered by the despots and the antagonists and the tyrants and all these kinds of things. I want you to think about this. If Paul had been given the opportunity to cast a ballot in a political scenario that would be more conducive to spreading the gospel, do you think he would have participated in that process and cast a ballot, or do you think he would have bowed out? And while you're contemplating that, I want you to consider that once Paul actually invoked his Roman citizenship in order to better position himself in order to continue his work. I think that it's very obvious when we read Paul's letters and see what was written of him in the book of Acts. It's obvious that Paul's focus was on his mission to carry the gospel of the kingdom. And he knew that there was going to be adversity. He knew that there was going to be persecution as he shared the gospel of the kingdom, but he endured that persecution. He overcame it. Nevertheless, had he been given the opportunity to more freely evangelize in a situation with less persecution, do you think he would have, given the opportunity, cast a ballot in favor of such? Or would he have simply left it to chance? Now, I realize that this is debatable, but I tend to think that Paul would not have been indifferent to the opportunity if God had given it to him. So now let me transition from that, and let's talk about us today. And I'll start with me. For some time now, but I remember particularly in 2008 and 2012, I was at a place where I was wavering on whether to vote or not. I still voted in local elections because I was more in touch with what was going on then. But when it come to national elections, I was kind of getting jaded about it. And I had just kind of wondered within myself whether it even matters anymore. But I did find myself voting in those elections, but not so much for a candidate as much as it was against another candidate. In fact, I've said this many times. The only time that I've ever really voted for a candidate was for Ronald Reagan in 1984. But every other election, it seemed to me that as a believer, I was being forced to choose between the lesser of two evils. And so now we come to 2016, where this dilemma I found myself in, and I believe others as well, was amplified even more. I knew that there was no way that I was going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and I think that should be obvious as to why. But I was also having a really hard time with the prospect of casting a vote for Donald Trump. And so at that point in time, I considered my choice to be deciding between which side of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil do I want to eat from. At that time, my assessment of Trump was that he was a braggart. He had been divorced and remarried multiple times. He was a man of questionable character, to say the least, and he was part of a world that, frankly, I wanted nothing to do with. Now, jump ahead to 2024, I will have to say that my position on Trump has evolved. There are things about him that I do like, actually. There are certain traits about him that I don't care for in terms of a person, and I know that I'm not the only one. And so I'm addressing the fact that I understand that there are many believers even today who cannot bring themselves to vote for Trump for this reason or for that reason. Some have vocalized that they're not going to vote for him in this election because of his non-committal committal to abortion in terms of a federal ban on abortion, for instance. And I get that. I understand that. And so I guess I want to say here that as a believer, I understand that our options are not what some of us would prefer. As I said, I have come to admire certain things about Trump, his tenacity, his bulldog-like persona. Those are traits that I admire. But there are some things that I don't like. I wish that tenacity and that vigor that he has could be tempered with modesty and more humility. And so I'm just conceding that there are some things about Trump that I can like, some things I don't particularly care for. And so then it is fair to say that when it comes to the person, in comparison to what we as believers are striving to emulate, and that is the Messiah, of course, the options that we have in people, as far as political candidates, are not what you and I would have as a first choice. They are not what you and I would regard as, quote, righteous choices. But we also need to consider this. While we would prefer our leaders to be a man of God, sometimes we are presented with God's man, and there's a difference. Moses was a man of God. Nebuchadnezzar was God's man, chosen for a purpose. Cyrus was God's man, chosen for a purpose. And I'm going to say this. I believe, in times past at least, Trump has been God's man, chosen for a purpose, not necessarily a man of God. In other words, God's ways are not ours. His thoughts are above ours. No matter how holy and how righteous we think we are, God still has ways that we have a hard time understanding. So I don't want you to get me wrong here. I'm not saying that it is God's will that Trump be elected. I don't know that. I'm just saying that there's a difference between a man of God and God's man. My dad used to say that if I waited until I could afford children, of course, this was a long time ago, but he said if I waited until I could afford to have children, I would never have children. I think most of us understand what that means. Likewise, if we wait until the perfect candidate comes along, we will never vote because there is no perfect candidate, because there's no perfect person. There is no perfect government. There is no perfect leader, and there will not be a perfect leader until the Messiah comes and puts all of his enemies under his feet and makes the nations his footstool. And so until that day, what are you and I to do? Are we to remove our hands from the process at large and just walk away and just let whatever is going to happen, happen? Again, I know that there are some who feel very strongly that that is exactly what we should do. And this is the position that we should take on the matter. And while I understand the reason they can feel that way, I don't agree with it. Not anymore. Let me share this with you. There are, at this very moment, many ultra-Orthodox Jews living in the land of Israel who do not recognize the state of Israel or its government as being legitimate. In their view, the state of Israel has no religious significance. Its authority, as they see it, is legitimate only to the extent that other non-Jewish governments are legitimate. They treat Israeli Independence Day as just another working day. In other words, they do not acknowledge it. Believe it or not, some of these ultra-Orthodox Jews actually protest against the Israeli government. They resist serving in the IDF, and in some cases, they have aligned themselves with pro-Palestinian groups. And why? Because of their view of the Scripture. Their view is only the Messiah can establish a legitimate government for a nation called Israel. Now, to a degree, I totally get what they're saying. We're all looking ahead to a time when the nations are subject to Messiah's rule. However, these people who deride the state of Israel and its government and its leaders nevertheless benefit from the freedoms and from the blessing that living in Israel provides. And so, as you might imagine, because of their non-participation and for their resistance against Israel as a state, not every Israeli looks upon these people with the best, they don't see them in the most positive light. I'll put it that way. What's my point? If we're going to gladly and willfully reap the benefits of living in a relatively free nation, a nation that continues to be blessed when compared to so many others. I mean, it could be a lot worse, folks. If we are going to reap the benefits, should we not participate in the process that's there in place so that hopefully we can assist in the propagation of those freedoms and those blessings, not just the material things. I'm not just talking about those things. I'm talking about having the ability to do exactly what I'm doing right now, to speak my mind to you freely and without threat of your government coming in and shutting me down. Although YouTube may say something about this, I don't know. Now, in spite of the fact that some Jews don't recognize the current state of Israel as being what has been prophesied, and to a degree, I agree. However, who can deny that the current nation of Israel is a miracle? The fact that it exists at all is a testament to the faithfulness of God. And even with their shortcomings as a nation, can anyone truly deny that God's hand has been on its people? Can we deny that he has intervened on behalf of Israel and it's on the IDF and on behalf of the people? Can we deny that he's been hands off since it became a nation in 1948? Because I believe to deny that God has had a hand in it, is to deny reality. Likewise, even with all of the issues and all of the warts and flaws that plague this nation, and there are many, these things are here. Nonetheless, the fact that we are still here as a nation, to me, is evidence of God's hand. It's evidence of God's sovereignty and his mercy. Will there ever be a perfect situation in the United States? There will not. Not until the Messiah returns and he makes the kingdoms of this world the kingdoms of our God and of his Messiah will we see perfection and completion. But until then, even as we look toward that day, we can't be so focused on the future that we fail to function in the present. I like to underscore this point sometimes in talking about George Custer, and I won't go into all the details of it, but the reason that Custer and those men were massacred at Little Bighorn was because Custer was so focused on the future, or what he thought the future was going to be, that he didn't pay attention to the 5,000 Cheyenne and Sioux warriors that were charging up the hill. My point is, we can't be so heavenly minded that we are of no earthly good. Yes, we keep an eye on the future. We always do. We look toward what is coming, but we have to function in the present. You see, God created this earth to be inhabited by his people. In the end, heaven is coming down to the earth. And what I mean to say here is God is not abandoning his purpose for this earth. And he's not abandoning the purpose to fill this earth with his people. And so until that day comes, it is to us to wage war against the kingdom of darkness. And if we are to wage war, that requires us from time to time to take action. And I realize we're talking about spiritual matters here, but spiritual matters have an impact on physical things. And sometimes we have to, in order to advance the spiritual nature of things, engage in things in the physical world. Now, I realize that voting in an election does not necessarily advance the kingdom of heaven. I don't want you to think that that's what I'm saying. But in this election, this particular election, the outcome, depending on what it is, could certainly hamper our efforts to do what we've been called to do as it relates to the kingdom of heaven. I want to go back to what I was saying in regard to Paul. If he had been given the opportunity to cast a ballot and bring about a scenario where he could more freely spread the gospel, I think he would have done it. So again, I don't think that voting in an election per se necessarily advances the kingdom of heaven. But in this particular situation we find ourselves in, depending on what the outcome is, what we have been called to do, we might find a little bit more difficult. Look what's going on in the world today. Besides Israel, what other nation is going to be an impediment to radical Islam and all these other despots around the world? God can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants. He uses whoever he wants. Thus far, he has chosen, in part, to use this nation. I realize, and I look forward to the day when Israel, under the kingship of the Messiah, eventually becomes the premier nation of the world. But until that time, you and I are charged with this command to occupy till he comes, to contend for the kingdom of heaven, to fight for the kingdom of heaven, for God and his righteousness. And that occupy, that statement, to me is a military term, which means we are to fight to the best of our ability. Again, I realize it's spiritual. I get that. But I believe this election is about spiritual issues, not political ones. Think of it this way. You and I are called to be salt. That's a mandate that we are given. In fact, there are some pretty bad consequences if we aren't salt. But what is salt supposed to do? Well, in part, it is used to preserve things, which is to say, in my view anyway, to promote life. Or if you want to look at it this way, to extend life at the very least. I realize that there are some in the body of Messiah who are of the view that America is inherently corrupt. The founders followed Masonic, even occultic practices in the view of some. Ironically, by the way, that is exactly what many of the extreme left have to say about America, although not for the same reasons. But anyway, because there are those who feel very strongly about this, some of their mind that everything here just needs to crash and burn. God just needs to bring it to an end and consequently hasten the Messiah's return. Well, good for you perhaps, but what about those souls that are still out there? Those that God still wants to see come into the kingdom. Not to mention, what would that mean for your children and your grandchildren if the Messiah doesn't return in the next few years? So even if America has all these warts and flaws, even if, and obviously it will, America has to answer for sins and transgressions, are you okay with willfully and apathetically turning things over to people who want to indoctrinate our children even more than they already have? Not me. I'm not willing to do that. I'm going to do whatever I can to stand against those things, doing what I'm doing right now, sharing these things. And in this particular case, going into a polling booth and casting a ballot. And I'm going to do everything I know to do to stand against these things that are blatantly and obviously wicked, even if I have to vote for a man who is a braggart. I get it. America has a lot of warts and flaws. Corporately, we have turned away from God and from his righteousness, and we are guilty of many sins that we will have to give an answer for. That is a fact. Now, not that what I'm about to say is an excuse, but there is no other nation on the face of the earth who has not done that, including Israel. I realize to whom much is given, much is required. I'm not dismissing that. But Israel is kind of in the same boat. And if that were not so, then he would not have told them, look, you're going to go into the land, you're going to turn to other gods. And in short, what I'm trying to say here is that all nations, until the Messiah comes, every nation, including this one, will fall short in terms of righteousness. Again, that is not an excuse to do what is wrong. But what I am saying is, until the day that God says, where America is concerned, enough, until the day comes when he says, all right, now it's time for America to answer for your transgressions. As his people, you and I need to stay focused on why we are here. What is the purpose? To function in that purpose. Why we're here in this place at this time. And then to vie for those opportunities that are given to us by God that allow us to continue to pursue that purpose, to continue to do the things that we've been called to do. What is that purpose? It is to contend for the kingdom of heaven, not to see America continue as the supreme and sole superpower of the earth. That is destined for Israel. But yet we are to contend for the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And that being so, should that not also include upholding and fighting for those values that the kingdom upholds? Life, freedom, order. To make our voice heard when faced with those who are vigorously fighting for things that stand in opposition to those values of the kingdom, shouldn't we rise up? Shouldn't we make our voice heard? Shouldn't we stand against those things and stand in support of the values that I mentioned? Our purpose is certainly not to fold our arms and watch the world burn from the sidelines. That is not our purpose. And so if there is anything that we can do to prolong the opportunity to do what we've been called to do, should we not do that? For the sake of those who are ignorant of these things, should we not do it? Think about Abraham. When the Lord of the whole earth visits Abraham in his tent and is told that he's going to go down and he's going to deal with the 5 cities of the plain, Sodom, Gomorrah, etc., what did Abraham ask? He had consideration for those who may not be guilty of certain things, and he asked, would the judge of the whole earth condemn the righteous with the wicked? Won't you spare the city for the sake of the righteous? In other words, there are people out there who it may be God's purpose for them to still come into the kingdom. So we don't want it to burn down just yet, not before God has said that's enough. Don't want that to happen. Now, yeah, there's those people like Jonah who are sent to Nineveh to tell the people to repent. And then when they do, and they repent in sackcloth and ash, he gets all disgruntled and he gets all mad because God has shown mercy to this people because they actually repented. We need to remember that God is not anxious to destroy the wicked. God is desirous that the wicked should come to repentance and turn from their wickedness. And should you and I not desire that as well, rather than taking the attitude, I'll just burn it down? You remember that David once prayed for God to spare his infant child, even though that baby was the result of his sin. But still, he fasted, he prayed, he appealed to God for mercy. Now, God eventually answered, and in that particular case, the answer was no. But the point is, he appealed to God and he kept praying until God answered definitively. And he prayed that God would allow that child to live. So my point here is that in spite of our national sin, in spite of all the things that we do have to give an account for the sake of those who do not understand what they are doing right now, for the sake of those who are doing these wicked things throughout the world, should we not at least pray that God will allow the child to live long enough that you and I have the opportunity to continue being preachers of righteousness? For all of its warts and flaws, America, by God's grace, has been a nation that has provided stability in the world and may yet have the opportunity to continue in that particular purpose. Consider what a strong supporter of Israel America has been up until this point in time. Now, of course, ultimately, God is their source, God is their defender, God is their protector, and he wants Israel to look to him and him alone as their source for everything. Yet, it's true that God works through people. And so where you and I in this country are concerned, might it be, and I'm asking the question now, might it be that you and I as a nation still have work to do? And if there is work yet to do, we have to do it while it is day. It is a certainty that night is coming when no man can work. However, it is advantageous to the work of the kingdom of God that God would provide as much light and as for long as possible. And here's what I'm getting at. There was a story in the book of Joshua where the children of Israel were fighting the Canaanites, and the battle went long into the day, and it was getting late in the day, And so Joshua prayed that the sun would stand still. In effect, he asked God to extend the daylight hours, thus allowing Israel time, additional time, to finish the work that they were engaged in. So, with that thought in mind, is it wrong for God's people here in America to pray and to ask for more daylight, so to speak, so that we can continue in and so that we can hopefully finish the work that He's given us to do here and now in this nation? Again, night is coming. God has that in control. We see the signs of these things everywhere. The nations are growing increasingly corrupt. The nations are continuing to align themselves against Israel. But if we still have work to do here in this nation, I want God to give us as much daylight, so to speak, as He is willing to do so that we can continue doing that work. I don't want this nation, at least while you and I are at our post, I don't want this nation to be one of those nations that aligns itself against Israel. I want to do everything that God will allow to make certain that this nation is not one of those nations. I don't want our apathy and indifference to provide an opportunity to those who would use the power of the United States to oppress Israel and to make them make them more vulnerable, lest we be judged in the matter. I don't think that we can afford to be hands off and allow radicals and progressives to run roughshod over you and me and over our children and over Israel, because we have seen what some of these people will do if they have power. We might even consider that the reason we have a Biden-Harris administration is so in order to demonstrate what will happen if we decide to remove our hand from the situation, and that is to not participate. So I know what I need to do, and I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do that because I believe God has allowed me to have some insight and wisdom. And so when I do what I can do, and that's all I can do, I'm going to leave the rest to Him. And for that reason, and because the stakes are so high right now, I cannot sit this election out and to walk away and just say, okay, Sarah, it doesn't work for me. Now, at the same time, participating in the process in the hopes that God's mercy will be extended to this nation doesn't mean that we can ignore what must happen spiritually in us and in this nation. No man, no woman, no political party can save this nation. No political philosophy is going to save this nation. Repentance, spiritual renewal, returning to God, that is our only true hope. And if we believe that, and I know you do, why would we then, through apathy and inaction, concede even more spiritual ground to those who stand in opposition to law and order and biblical principle and standards and righteousness? Why would we do that? I realize that Trump is not what all of us would like for him to be, but I do know that Harris and her party are definitely not what I want to see leading this nation from the White House or from the halls of Congress. But Bill, all of the politicians, both sides are all corrupt, they're all crooked. Yeah, I get it. I realize they're politicians. But at this point, considering what is on the line in this particular election, making the one party to be as corrupt as the other party, to me, is like equating someone who is consumed with leprosy with someone who has a bad case of acne. When it comes to what these two sides are pushing, in my view, there is no comparison. In other words, I'll take Trump's acne over Harris's leprosy any day of the week. In 2016, we didn't know what Trump was going to do, but we certainly knew what Hillary was liable to do. We knew what she would not do. Where Trump is concerned, I had no reason to believe that he would move the United States Embassy to Jerusalem. Not even Reagan did that. I didn't know that Trump was going to acknowledge the Golan Heights as being sovereign Israeli territory. No one else did that. In the words of Kamala Harris, Trump, quote, hand-selected 3 Supreme Court justices with the intent of overturning Roe v. Wade. No other president did that. I certainly didn't realize in 2016, as I was trying to determine what to do, that Trump would do those kinds of things. In other words, he may not be the most spiritual of men. He may not and is not as spiritual as I would like for him to be. He's not as humble as I would like for him to be. But at least he invites those who proclaim that Jesus is Lord and that Christ is King to the podium to speak at his rallies, rather than telling them that they're at the wrong rally and having them escorted out. Now, if Trump is elected, without a doubt, I know that he'll do things, he'll say things, and he'll make decisions that I will not agree with. At this point, I can't be certain what that is. I'm sure that'll happen. But on the other hand, if Harris is elected, I've got a pretty good idea of what we'll get. And knowing that, I can't sit idly by and not make my voice known. Indifference and inaction to the matter, and as far as I'm concerned, is a vote in this regard. I want you to consider this. When an unclean spirit goes out of the house, he eventually comes back to check things out. And if he finds the house empty, which is not good, he gets 7 of his friends, and then they all move in and they make the matter much worse. Now, though it may be apples and oranges to what we're talking about, here's what I'm getting at. If we don't stand up for what is right, and if we don't stand up for a scenario that makes proclaiming the truth possible in an observable way, and by that I mean going to the polls, then we are effectively leaving the house empty. And in leaving the house empty and walking away from this situation without taking appropriate actions, I believe we're leaving the door open for something even more undesirable to come in and take up residence. When the house is empty of what is holy, it will be inhabited by what is evil. And what I mean by that is if we don't move to try to put good leaders, at least as best we can, in the White House, in Congress, and our state houses, if we don't do that, then you can rest assured that bad leaders are going to be there. So then are we so holier than thou that we're going to be okay with that outcome? Are we so self-righteous that we're going to be willing to sit back and just let whatever's going to happen, and then allow even more obvious and even more militant wickedness to permeate the land? And so are we prepared to let our inaction cede even more ground to the powers of darkness? Now, here's something I have long believed and I have taught. The lawless one, the son of perdition, the Antichrist, he's not going to give birth to lawlessness. Lawlessness is going to give birth to the lawless one. And so for that reason, you and I, as the people of God, need to do everything that we can to resist the spread of lawlessness, to stand up against the acceptance of lawlessness. Well, I can't vote for Trump because of XYZ. How can you, Bill, vote for someone who's done this and who's done that, who said this? Look, I'm not really going into this with the idea of supporting a person or a candidate. I'm going into this with the idea of supporting a purpose. Not a party, but the hope that you and I can continue to function in our purpose. Yes, the Bible predicts that there will inevitably be a time of lawlessness, unprecedented lawlessness, in fact. Maybe that time is now. Maybe that's what we've come to. But if I have an opportunity to stand against it, if I have an opportunity to vote for and hopefully induce a season and a time where we can more freely work to do what we've been called to do with less duress, then that's what I'm going to do. Choosing not to do this is, in my view, choosing to hasten the lawlessness that will surely come. In other words, in some ways, our non-participation may help fulfill that particular prophecy. Now, I acknowledge also that it has been in spite of duress and persecution, some might even argue because of persecution, that the gospel of the kingdom has been advanced into the world. But it is also clear to me that in Messiah's day, the people who rejected him had a choice not to. In other words, he gave them and he gives us a choice. When he rode into Jerusalem just before his crucifixion, he lamented the fact that though he wanted to gather them as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, they were not willing to be gathered. They were not willing to seize upon the opportunity that was being given to them. And because of that, their house was left to them desolate. And being desolate, it opened the door for a destroyer to come in and to take their nation down. Yes, the gospel spread. But my point here is perhaps you and I are being given an opportunity for another outcome, for an opportunity to continue to function in our purpose without the overwhelming persecution. The people in Messiah's day had an opportunity to be gathered, but because they were too hard-hearted, because they were too short-sighted, and because they were too self-righteous to see it, there was a different outcome. My confidence, my hope is not in Donald Trump, it's not in the Republican Party, nor is my devotion being given to them. My devotion is to God and to God's purposes. My hope and my confidence is in the Almighty, the God of Israel. But until he returns, we are to occupy. We are to advance against the kingdom of darkness. We are to take territory away from the realm of darkness, not to shrug our shoulders in apathy and allow them to take more ground from us. Again, I know that there are believers who feel very strongly that we should not insert ourselves into the political realm and get involved with these kinds of issues. Well, if you're one of those, I'm sorry, I disagree with you. We can't afford to sit this one out. I'm not here to advance a political agenda. I'm here to hopefully promote righteousness and godly principle, even in an arena that we know embraces and coddles corruption. But think about this. Did not the early Christians, and particularly those who were martyred, albeit in a different arena, didn't they, well, let me put it this way. They were surrounded by these ravenous lions. They were placed in this arena to be sport. And yet in that arena, they still committed themselves to be a light in the face of their oppressors. What I'm getting at is, yes, I know that the political arena is corrupt, but should we not even then, and in that arena, be light? I'm not comparing our plight today to those early believers who were martyred for their faith, but I am suggesting that like them, in every arena, including the political one, you and I should be a light. We should be front and center, and we should not remain silent. Now, ultimately, God is in control. Only he can save us. Still, I will cast my vote, and then I will leave the rest to him. And in a matter of speaking, that is the point that I'm trying to make today. He is in control, but a lot of what he does in the earth, he does through his people like you and me. And so my position is, at least as God allows, and for as long as he sees fit, I think it is better to advocate for and to participate in a society that stands against the lunacy and the lawlessness that is running rampant in our world today. And so if my vote can help advance that scenario, how irresponsible is it of me to walk away from it? I won't pretend to know what God's will in the matter is. And by that, I mean whether or not Trump or Harris is to be the president. I don't know. But I know what I must do based on what he has revealed to me, based on what I understand of biblical principle. Likewise, you do what you feel you must, but I would encourage you to act on principle, biblical principle, rather than emotion. Consider purpose over person. And may God have mercy on our nation. But even so, come Lord Yeshua.
If you enjoyed these videos and value our content here at Jacob's Tent, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell and never miss the latest info and insights from Bill and the team. And most of all, you can help us spread the message. By sharing these videos with others, you'll be helping to grow our interactive community together.